He was trained never to move, never to react, never to let the world see what he felt. But on the day of the Queen's funeral, in front of thousands, one royal guard did the unthinkable. And when he did, no one in that crowd could hold back their tears. Now, before we reveal the full story, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness isn't just about protocol. It's about the moment silence broke, and the world saw what it truly meant to stand. The grey overcast hung low over Windsor that morning, like the sky itself had dressed in mourning. Every cobblestone on the long walk glistened from an earlier rain, and the dampness in the air clung to the skin like a shroud. No birds sang, no traffic passed, just silence, thick, reverent silence, as thousands of mourners lined the path leading to St. George's Chapel. Inside the barracks, Lance Corporal Thomas Reed fastened the final brass button on his scarlet tunic with deliberate precision. His hands, usually steady as steel, trembled slightly. He paused, closed his eyes and breathed out through his nose. He was 29, 8 years in the Coldstream Guards. Dozens of parades, foreign visits, jubilee events. He had stood outside the palace through sleet, scorching sun and political protest. But nothing, not even that bitter February ceremony in Hyde Park, felt like today, because this wasn't just Her Majesty's funeral, it was his grandfather's too. Not officially, of course, but 10 days earlier, retired Colour Sergeant Malcolm Reed, who had once stood in this same uniform outside the Queen Mother's memorial, had passed away in his sleep, 91 years old, still polishing his medals once a month, still correcting his grandson's posture at family barbecues, still humming regimental marches like they were lullabies. Thomas hadn't gone to the burial, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't. His name had been selected weeks earlier for this assignment. Guard detail for the Queen's final procession. Only a handful were chosen from the regiment. You didn't turn that down, not even for blood. The last thing his grandfather had ever told him, spoken from a hospice bed beneath a fading Coldstream pennant, was simple. Don't miss your duty, lad. Not even for me. You show her the same respect you'd show me. That's how you honour both. Thomas adjusted the white belt across his chest, then reached for his bare skin. He held it for a second in his lap. That heavy, towering cap, iconic, burdensome, sacred, had belonged to his grandfather once, then his father. Now it was his. His reflection in the locker's steel surface stared back at him, face young, but eyes older, not just from grief, from the weight of history. "Time to go," came the voice from the hallway. Sergeant Mallory, clipped and steady as ever. Thomas stood, straightened, took one final breath, and stepped out. By the time they formed up on the long walk, the crowds had thickened. Black coats and umbrellas, veterans with medals pinned to wool, children on shoulders holding printed programs. The world had come to say goodbye. Thomas stood in formation 3 ranks from the front, each soldier placed with intention. He could feel the eyes, millions perhaps, watching. Cameras, drones, the watching world. And yet all he could hear was the echo of his grandfather's voice, as clear as it had been at the age of 7. "Stand still, Thomas. Stillness is louder than shouting if done right." The procession began, slow, deliberate, each step measured, boots hitting pavement in perfect unison. The Queen's casket, draped in the royal standard, drawn by the gun carriage and flanked by family and guardsmen alike. And behind the stoic face of Lance Corporal Thomas Reed, something churned. He wasn't just walking for a monarch today. He was walking for a man who had once stood on the very same stones, long before anyone thought the world would pause to say goodbye like this. 10 days ago, Thomas Reed had stood at the foot of a hospital bed, gripping a weathered hand that no longer gripped back. His grandfather had been more than just a military man. He was the family's anchor, the kind of figure who spoke little, but never needed to raise his voice to command a room. He'd served under 5 prime ministers, and once saluted the Queen herself on horseback during trooping the colour. But in the final hours of his life, Malcolm Reed hadn't spoken of medals or memories, only duty. "You'll be guarding her," he'd whispered, voice thin as parchment. "Don't miss it. Don't miss her, not even for me." Thomas had nodded. "I won't, Grandad." And he hadn't. Even when the funeral date came in, just 3 days before the Queen's, the family agreed. Grandad would have insisted he stay, so they buried the old colour sergeant without his grandson present, without the only other soldier in the family to fold the flag over his coffin. Now Thomas stood motionless under the leaden skies of Windsor, boots planted precisely on the wet stone of the Long Walk. The Queen's casket moved slowly ahead of him, pulled by the gun carriage. A hush blanketed the crowd, thick with reverence. Somewhere nearby, a church bell tolled once. The sound rang like an echo from the past. Every step of this procession felt like it belonged to history. And yet, Thomas wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about the man who'd taught him to shine his boots so well they reflected the clouds. The man who'd taught him that dignity wasn't about rank. It was about how you stood when no one was clapping. His jaw clenched, eyes forward, breathing measured. The ceremonial pace was slow, each step counted and practiced. But the weight in his chest didn't move with the march. It just sank heavier. A few feet ahead, one of the newer guards, a 20-year-old fresh from training, began to falter. His heel slipped slightly on the wet stone, wobbling just enough for a trained eye to notice. Without hesitation, Thomas adjusted by half a step, subtly shifting formation so that the symmetry was preserved. A correction that would never be noticed on the newsreels, but one his grandfather would have caught instantly. They were nearing the final stretch now. The castle rose in solemn grandeur ahead, its ancient towers watching over this final act of farewell. St. George's Chapel waited just beyond. A ripple of movement passed through the crowd as the Queen's casket came into full view. People lowered umbrellas, straightened posture, pressed hands to hearts. Some bowed their heads. Others raised small Union flags with trembling hands. A child's voice piped up from somewhere near the front line of mourners. "Mum, is that a real soldier?" The woman shushed her gently, but the question lingered in the air like smoke. Thomas blinked. For one brief second, the world blurred, not from tears, but memory. He was 10 years old again, standing beside his grandfather at the Tower of London, asking that same question. And the answer had been whispered to him then, in the quiet voice of pride. A real soldier doesn't need a battlefield, just a reason to stand. He clenched his jaw tighter. No movement, no expression. But inside? The second funeral had already begun. The procession slowed as it approached the final incline towards St. George's Chapel. The curve of the Long Walk framed the casket like a painting, the Queen's standard fluttering softly in the wind. Every footstep echoed against the stone, and the world seemed to grow quieter with each metre they covered, like time itself was holding its breath. Lance Corporal Thomas Reed held his position without falter, arms at his sides, chin level, eyes locked forward on the horizon just above the casket. It was a gaze they were all taught, somewhere between reverence and detachment, the kind of look that said, "I see everything, but I feel nothing." But Thomas felt everything. He felt it in the back of his throat, dry and raw, in the deep ache behind his eyes, in the way his shoulders trembled ever so slightly beneath the scarlet wool. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours the night before, and the weight of that morning, the Queen's casket before him, his grandfather's absence behind him, was pressing down like armour forged from grief. A breeze swept through the crowd, and with it came a hush even deeper than before. They were approaching the final turn before the chapel steps. And that's when he saw them, just behind the rope line, across the path to the right, 3 familiar faces. His mother, standing stiffly in a long black coat, her gloved hands folded tightly in front of her. Beside her, his younger sister Anna, eyes already brimming. And next to her, nothing. Just an empty space where someone else should have been, someone who would have never missed this. Thomas's mother met his gaze. Not directly, but with the kind of angle that let her acknowledge him without breaking the moment. She gave the smallest nod, a twitch of the chin, lips pressed together so tightly they lost all colour. And then she looked away, down at the casket. The breath caught in his chest. He was trained not to move, not to show emotion, not even to blink too long. But something cracked. He didn't sob, he didn't tremble, he didn't break rank. All he did, against years of conditioning, was blink once. Hard, and in that blink, a single tear escaped. It traced a line down his cheek, barely visible beneath the edge of his bearskin cap. But it was there, in full view of the crowd. He told himself it was sweat, that it didn't count, that maybe no one noticed, but they had. A child near the rope whispered something. An older man shifted his stance. A woman brought a hand to her heart. And then, as the casket drew parallel with his position, Thomas did something unthinkable. He moved. Not much, not enough to disrupt the march, but enough to matter. He lifted his chin, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge the Queen's casket, with something more human than protocol allowed, a gesture that wasn't in the manual, that had no precedent, just 1 inch upward, one silent personal farewell. The entire world didn't stop. The casket rolled on. The pipes continued to play. No orders were shouted. No officers broke formation. But for one heartbeat, everything around him faded into stillness. He thought of his grandfather's words. If you're going to break the rules, make it mean something. The moment passed. He lowered his head again. Perfect posture, eyes forward, motionless once more. But something had changed, not just in him, but in the air. It was as though the crowd had felt the shift, not through spectacle or sound, but through presence, through the understanding that even among perfect stillness sometimes, the smallest movement could carry the most profound weight. Behind him, one of the veteran guards, a man twice his age, murmured without turning his head, "Was that for your granddad?" Thomas didn't answer. Couldn't, because answering would mean breaking again. And right now, he had to hold the line for both of them. Protocol demanded stillness. But the smallest deviation, just a single tilt of the chin, had echoed louder than any speech ever could. Though the pipes continued and the gun carriage rolled forward, a new kind of stillness had taken hold. Not the ceremonial kind trained into guards through repetition, but the kind that comes from reverence, from witnessing something real. A few feet away, one of the pallbearers, an officer in full dress blues, glanced at Thomas. Just a glance, no expression, but his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked ahead again, never breaking stride. The Queen's casket passed the halfway mark toward the chapel steps. In the crowd, silence deepened, and yet something moved among them. An awareness, a recognition that not all ceremony was cold, that sometimes grief slips through the armour of tradition, and when it does, it carries more weight than all the gold braid and pageantry combined. An elderly woman near the front, wrapped in a charcoal shawl, had seen the moment. She stood just a few yards from Thomas, her gloved hand trembling as she clasped it over her mouth. Her cane rested against the barrier. Her eyes were locked on him. Not the casket, not the princes walking behind it, not the music. Him. Tears welled in her eyes as if she, too, had lost someone beyond royalty. Behind her, a child tugged his father's sleeve. "Daddy?" "That one moved," he whispered, pointing toward Thomas. The father shushed him gently but didn't correct him, because the boy was right. The movement had been small, but it had cracked something open. Further down the rope line, a man in a military beret, likely retired judging by the stiffness of his salute, lowered his hand. Then, with quiet dignity, he brought his hand to his chest and nodded once directly at Thomas. A ripple of recognition began to spread, not through noise, but through gesture. A woman in her 30s pressed her palm to her heart and bowed her head. A schoolteacher whispered, "That's why we teach them about this. That's why it matters." Near the steps of the chapel, one of the Queen's chaplains caught sight of the disturbance, not because of any disruption, but because he'd noticed something shift in the crowd's expression. As he turned his head, his gaze briefly met Thomas's, and in the middle of a historic state funeral, the chaplain gave the smallest nod, a private moment, unspoken permission, as if to say, "We saw it and we understand." Thomas didn't move again. His posture was perfect now, his face a mask of duty once more. But the damage was done. Or maybe the healing had begun. Because what had started as an unintentional crack in discipline had become something more powerful than the procession itself. The moment the Queen's casket reached the chapel steps, the entire formation drew to a ceremonial halt. Pipers stilled. Boots stopped clicking. A long pause filled the air, a silence that didn't feel like absence, but like presence magnified. Thomas stared ahead, vision blurry now, not from tears, but from the sheer intensity of what he'd just allowed himself to feel. He could sense the casket being lifted, could hear the faint groan of leather gloves gripping polished wood, the crunch of soles against stone. But mostly he felt eyes. The crowd was no longer watching the Queen alone. They were watching him, not out of curiosity, not scandal, out of respect. He had become, in that one slight movement, a living symbol of something deeper than ceremony. A reminder that grief wears a uniform too, that even the most rigid protocols can't hold back the human heart forever. One of the junior guards closest to him whispered, just loud enough for Thomas to hear, "Whatever that was, it mattered." And Thomas said nothing, because some things, especially the truest things, don't need to be spoken at all. Inside the cool stone walls of St. George's Chapel, the air was thick with history. The vaulted ceiling loomed above like the weight of centuries. Stained glass, casting muted colours across the stone floor where kings and queens had once walked and now rested. Thomas Reed stood just outside the inner chamber, still on duty, posted along the outer corridor with 2 other guards. They were stationed not for show, but to maintain solemnity, to preserve order for those within who mourned, prayed, or remembered. Through the heavy doors, muffled hymns drifted out. A choir sang with a clarity that struck something in his chest. Notes not unlike those his grandfather used to hum while polishing boots, soft melodies that never left the bone. A beam of light broke through one of the chapel's side windows, cutting across the flagstones. For a brief moment, it landed directly on Thomas's shoulder. Warm. Software. As if some invisible hand had placed it there, just long enough to say, "I see you." The door to his left creaked open. An officer emerged, wearing the dark uniform of ceremonial command. Not one Thomas recognised directly, but by the stripes and ribbons, clearly someone of rank. He stepped forward slowly, looking like he was meant to speak quietly, even in the loudest of rooms. "You're Lance Corporal Reed?" the officer asked in a low voice. "Yes, sir." There was a pause. The officer's tone didn't change, but his eyes softened. "You moved during the procession." Thomas didn't answer immediately. His pulse picked up. He could feel the old training rise in him. Defensiveness, apology, a readiness to explain. But instead he simply said, "I did, sir." Another pause. Then the officer leaned closer, not in threat but in understanding. "Broke protocol, just slightly." "Yes, sir." The officer nodded. "You also reminded an entire nation that grief doesn't check in at the gates." Thomas remained still, unsure what to say. "You're not in trouble," the man continued. "Truth is, there are more of us who needed that moment than you might think." With that, the officer placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Not long, not indulgent, but enough. Then he turned and disappeared back down the corridor, his boots echoing softly against the ancient stone. Thomas exhaled slowly. When the service concluded, the chapel doors opened and mourners began to exit in hushed lines, faces pale with emotion, some visibly shaken, others visibly comforted. Among them was the elderly woman from earlier, the one who had seen him break formation. She moved slower now, gripping the arm of a steward for balance, but as she passed Thomas's post, she paused, reached into her coat, and pulled out a folded photograph. She held it up just long enough for him to see. A black and white image, blurry around the edges, but clear where it counted. A young soldier in Coldstream red, standing guard in front of Westminster Abbey. The jawline unmistakable, the eyes identical. "My father," she whispered. "We buried him last month. He stood where you stood, 50 years ago." Thomas felt his throat tighten. She folded the photo again and nodded. He would have been proud of what you did today, for the Queen, for all of us. Then she moved on, lost in the sea of black coats and fading footsteps. Thomas didn't move, couldn't. Not because of training this time, because if he had, he might have broken again. Rain began to fall as the guards marched back toward the barracks. Not the kind that lashes or floods, just a soft, persistent drizzle, the kind that soaks without sound. The procession was over. The casket had been lowered. The bells had rung. Now all that remained was the long walk back, boots striking damp gravel in solemn rhythm. No one spoke. Inside the barracks, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and polished leather. The ceremonial silence extended itself here too, not out of discipline, but out of need. No one wanted to break what had settled over them. Lance Corporal Thomas Reed reached his locker and carefully unfastened each button on his tunic. His hands moved with the same ritual his grandfather had taught him. Fold at the shoulder seam first, never tug at the sleeves, lay the belt flat across the chest. His bare skin came off next. He held it for a moment in both hands, then placed it on the wooden peg above his uniform. Its weight seemed doubled now, not from moisture, but from memory. As he turned to remove his boots, he heard someone approach from behind. The scuff of slightly uneven steps gave it away before the voice confirmed it. It was Private Saunders, young, bright-eyed, just out of his first year, the same guard who had nearly slipped earlier. He hovered awkwardly for a second, then cleared his throat. "Corporal Reed!" Thomas looked over but said nothing. Saunders stepped forward, eyes uncertain. "I saw what you did during the procession. I thought we weren't allowed to move." Thomas's expression remained unreadable. He took a moment, finishing the fold on his gloves before answering. "We're not?" Saunders's face flushed. "Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I wasn't criticizing, just..." Thomas cut him off gently. "We're not allowed to move, but we're also not supposed to forget why we're standing." The younger man went quiet. Thomas stood fully now, not towering, but composed, measured. The storm in his eyes had calmed, but hadn't left. "You don't move for discomfort, or pride, or nerves," he said. "But sometimes, if it's for the right reason, if it's for someone who stood before you, you move an inch, and let the rest of the world remember what stillness is really for." Saunders nodded slowly, absorbing it. As he turned to leave, he said quietly, "Your grandfather, he would have been proud." Thomas didn't reply. When the barracks emptied, he remained behind, just for a few minutes, long enough to sit on the bench in front of his locker, breathing in the quiet, letting the weight settle properly now that duty had passed. Above him, taped to the inside of the locker door, was an old photograph, not the one the woman had shown him, but another copy, taken decades earlier, same posture, same uniform, same line of duty. Malcolm Reed, Coldstream Guard, grandfather, teacher, and now absent only in body. Thomas stared at it for a moment, then whispered under his breath, "I stood, Grandad. I didn't miss it." He closed the locker door gently, as though not to wake something, then stood. One last time that day, with his shoulders square, boots tight, and the silence behind him finally feeling like peace. If you had to choose between family and duty, which would you stand for? Do you believe there are moments when breaking the rules, quietly, respectfully, can mean more than following them? And if you were in that crowd, would you have noticed the single tear? Let us know in the comments below. We read everyone, and your stories matter more than you know. If this moment reminded you that true strength often shows in silence, give this video a like. It helps more than you think. Make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories, each one revealing the men behind the scarlet wool. And if someone you know still thinks these guards are just there for show, send them this story. It might change their mind. Other stories are already appearing on your screen, each one revealing something powerful and unexpected behind the uniform. Click one now, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.